Hey everyone, welcome back to this two-part video series where I show you how I make a resin toy. In this part, I'll be covering resin casting and finishing up the pieces. This is part 2 of how I made Rocky, the toy that can stand on all of his hands and feet. Let's get started. Just a quick recap, in the last video I made the molds for my toy and now we're ready to move on to resin casting. As you can see, I've got my mold sealed tight with rubber bands. I'm going to use a technique where I mix 3 different colors of resin to get a marbled look, kind of like stone. I start by preparing separate cups of resin, white, light gray, and dark gray. I add the catalyst to each one. The resin I'm using is Smooth On Casting Resin 305. This resin cures to a white color, so although it looks like I added too much black dye, it's actually going to get lighter. You want to thoroughly mix each cup, but this resin only has 7 minutes of work time before it begins curing, so I have to work fast. 7 minutes isn't a lot of time, so it's easy to want to rush, but that usually leads to mistakes. I try to be really calm when I do this, almost meditative to a zen-like state. Otherwise, I'm going to start to pour too fast, spill the resin, and end up ruining the batch. I always plan out how I'm going to pour the resin, which molds to pour first, etc. In order to be as efficient as possible, I pour one color into each of the molds at a time. So for example, here I pour light gray into the body molds first, then I move on to white, and lastly I'll do the dark gray. Then I'll alternate between the colors until the molds fill up, and then repeat for the head molds. And then I'll move all the molds to my pressure pot. Here's a time lapse of the resin curing. It usually happens at the center of the largest mass and then spreads out to the extremities. It's pretty cool to watch if you haven't seen it before. After 30 minutes, I take the molds out of the pressure pot. I open the molds and carefully ease the cured resin casts out. They're still a bit soft at this point, so I try not to handle them too rough. But check out that marbling pattern. It took me a few tries to achieve the look I wanted. I call this mastering the mold. Knowing the amount of each color to use and the best order to pour them in is crucial to getting the effect you want. This is something that can only be obtained through trial and error. It's tempting to use a bunch of crazy colors, but I like to keep it simple and use similar colors when I do marbling. This creates a softer blending between the colors and just looks a lot more natural. Once you've experimented enough, you can pretty much achieve any effect you want. I'm really digging this overtone of white with the light gray and dark gray sort of filling in the gaps. Once I got the colors down, I just kept cranking them out. Even if I try to replicate the process for each batch, the colors still blend differently every time. This makes each Rocky one of a kind. That's why I love doing marbled resin. Moving on to cleaning up the resin casts, the first thing I do is cut off all the sprues using a flush cutter. If you want to know exactly which tools I use, I've listed most of them in the description of the video. I'm always trying out different ones to get the best results so that you guys will know what works best. Here I'm using a rotary tool with a sanding drum attachment to quickly grind away any excess left. This will be hidden once the head is in place, so I don't need to make it super smooth. For the surfaces that will be seen, I use an X-Acto knife instead. When you sand resin, the surface finish will look kind of matte and cloudy. You then need to polish it with a super fine grit in order to achieve that shiny look again. However, using a sharp blade cuts everything away in one even slice, leaving the surface extremely smooth and intact. My long hours of sanding and polishing resin from all my other toys really taught me that I just freaking hate sanding. I don't mind doing it on a master prototype that needs to be perfectly smooth. I actually enjoy the process of working through each level of sanding, moving closer and closer until I get that perfect finish. But it just feels like reinventing the wheel all over again when I have to do it for each and every resin cast. That's why I sculpted Rocky with this fractured stone texture as a way to get around it. I can chisel away any excess plastic and it doesn't ruin the effect. Now that Rocky's head and body are all cleaned up, it's time to attach them together. I'll hold his head in place for a couple of seconds to let the superglue work its magic. And there you go, one Rocky figure complete from head to toe. Next, I'll be setting gemstones in his eyes. To do this, I'm using a special drill bit that makes a perfect inset for the gemstones to sit in. Once the insets are drilled, I apply superglue using the tip of a pin. You only need the tiniest drop of glue for it to work. Otherwise, it'll just overflow. I'm using real black Cubix zirconia. These handy tweezers allow me to pick them up and carefully place them. My jewelry making teacher gave me the idea, so all the credit goes to her for this genius decision. I always knew Rocky was missing something, and the gemstone eyes really bring him to life. After completing the stone gray version of Rocky, I decided to create a chase variant for my first release. I wanted to add a surprise element, kinda like how mining for gems can be a bit of a gamble. To get a ruby gemstone effect, I'm using Smooth On Casting Resin 326, which is actually transparent. I'm doing the same marbling technique as before, but with red, purple, and clear resin. One thing I've noticed is that the clear resins tend to wear out the molds a lot quicker. I can make the molds last a lot longer if I only do a few, and they'll be all the more rarer. Oh, and if you're wondering why it takes me forever to make these videos, well, the main reason is that it just takes me forever to make these videos. I mean, for example, this resin pouring scene, I had to juggle between pouring the resin, moving the molds to the pressure pot, changing the camera angle, and then closing the pressure pot and pressurizing the resin inside. It's taken me years, guys, years just to get a handle on resin casting. As soon as you start adding in extra steps like this, you can really mess up a batch. Believe me, I've messed up so many times that I'm used to it by now. Failure just doesn't get me down anymore. In fact, I've learned that failure is the greatest teacher, not just in toy making, but life in general. I'm willing to fail 100 times trying something new than doing the same old thing. Who knows what I'll come up with? Make mistakes and learn from them. After all, nobody's perfect, right? But you know what is perfect? This ruby marbled resin. Oh yes, you've done it again, Kevin. Now, if that wasn't the best segue ever, I don't know what is. Honestly, I ran out of things to say like 2 minutes ago, but that's okay. Just look at this beautiful marbled resin. I love how the colors just work so well together, and it really looks like some raw ruby gemstone. After cleaning up the ruby resin pieces, I decided to varnish them with the clear coat to really make them shine. I'm using some Tamiya clear and brushing it on the surface. With the first coat, I left one of his feet unpainted so he could just stand on it while the rest of him dried. Then, I went back and finished coating him. Now we're pretty much finished. The best part of making toys is playing with them. I found that the easiest way to get them to stand is to hold them closer at the bottom, and then you press them down on the table until you can find their balance point. Although they can only pose 4 different ways, just by turning them and changing the angle, you can see how different each pose looks. One of the questions I've been getting the most is, can he stand on his head? Well, I didn't think of doing that at the time, but I can always go back to the sculpt and add that feature in. There's always room for improvement. I also designed this custom packaging for Rocky. I like the look of brown craft paper and it kinda goes well with the whole Rocky aesthetic. I made it a blind bag style so you won't know which one you're gonna get. You might get the stone gray version of Rocky, or you could win the rare ruby chase version. Each package is a surprise just waiting to be opened. That's it for this episode. Thanks for watching. If you like Rocky, please consider supporting my work by purchasing one on my shop. All the proceeds I make goes into things like tools and supplies, so I can keep creating even more fun toys for you all, and then invest in even better equipment. Oh wait, no, not again!